the story of the week, which is Sir Keir Starmer's decision to block Andy Burnham from returning to Westminster. Here is the rationale, the reason why they have done it. They expect to lose the by-election that will be called as a consequence of Andrew Gwynne stepping down. They expect to lose it even if Andy Burnham runs, and they would rather lose a by-election than lose the mayoralty. So if Andy Burnham pulls out of the mayoralty, resigns from that job 2 years after accepting it, runs for Parliament and loses because the threat posed by the Greens and by Reform is high, very real possibility that Labour could be pushed into third place in Gorton, and I don't know how much magic Andy Burnham brings to a by-election. I really don't, actually, and we may need calls from Manchester on that to fill us in on whether or not he carries a cachet akin to the one that Boris Johnson carried in London for many years and that Sadiq Khan carries today. Traditional Labour territory, though, both cities. So perhaps Johnson being more of an anomaly than Sadiq Khan. You've got around 50 Labour MPs signing a letter objecting to the decision. But I want to know what you think. In a way, I want to know whether you would sign it. The mood among the party grassroots is being described as febrile in the wake of the decision, which means that our job is to look at why it was done. And I don't know whether this is me being a little bit glass half full or whether it is, as in looking for positives in obvious negatives, or whether it is actually the grown-up and important thing to do, which much of the media won't do because it doesn't lend itself to this addiction that we have to drama. We are all addicted to drama. Or we have been since 2016, probably. The political diet prior to 2016, even with austerity, was much more beige than the political. I quite like beige food. But I'm British after all, but it was a much more beige we didn't know it was, but you think of the big flare-ups and the gaps between them, international foreign wars, obviously, but also things like the poll tax, the moments or the toppling of Margaret Thatcher, two events that were actually linked, or Michael Heseltine's resignation from the cabinet. These moments of high drama merit several chapters in politics textbooks. The textbooks covering the last 10 years, these sort of dramas are barely going to merit a page because another one will be along tomorrow. And it is that addiction to drama that I think explains some of the coverage of moments like this. One Labour MP said of the block on Andy Burnham, I suspect most of the parliamentary party will back the decision. The problem will come when we lose the by-election. The MP predicted that Labour would finish third at best, with the Greens and Reform UK fighting it out to win. If they lose that, I would suggest that Starmer is in all sorts of trouble. So what I want to examine today is the simple question of what you think about what the Prime Minister did. There's no point arguing that it wasn't his individual decision. The NEC has moved with Keir Starmer, albeit that his deputy offered up the single and solitary vote in favour of letting Andy Burnham stand. The rationale is that losing a by-election is better than losing the mayoralty. So the calculation is if we have an election for Mayor of Greater Manchester, we will lose it. And that is a much bigger surrender of power for the Labour Party than losing a by-election in a constituency that will it won't make a dent in the size of our majority. So think about all the moving parts here. That's moving part number one, is losing the mayoralty. And that being a much bigger deal. It's a much bigger job than being an MP. That's why Andy Burnham does it. So that is the risk. That is the belief that we will lose the mayoralty, and we don't want to run that risk, so we will run the risk of losing a by-election. That's the second moving part, because the odds are at the moment that they will lose that by-election. I think we learnt from Plaid Cymru down in Caerphilly that you can never say never in by-elections, but I don't know that you've got, with the possible exception of the Greens, I don't know that you've got the kind of wild card of a resurgent Plaid Cymru. So the second moving part is the by-election, which they also at the moment think they're probably going to lose. So they're choosing between a rock and a harder place. They're concluding that losing the mayoralty is a harder place than the rock. So they've gone for that. But if they then lose that by-election, which they think they're going to do, Keir Starmer's position becomes, fragile. And the calculation to risk losing the mayoralty will pale into the background, even if the calculation was correct. The risk of losing the mayoralty of Manchester is now off the table. So nobody is going to respond to a loss in the by-election by saying, oh, well, at least we didn't lose the mayoralty, because that hasn't been crystallised. It hasn't become a real enough prospect for people to actually put it on the scales when assessing whether or not running the risk of and then losing a by-election was the correct thing to do. And then you've got the backbench rebellion, which is, as with all backbench rebellions, close to immeasurable. You can count the 50 signatures on the letters. You can count the 50 signatures on the letter objecting to the decision to block him from standing. But some people might have signed that after lunch. Some people might have signed it in a fit of pique. Some people might have signed it in blood, so passionate are their feelings. Some people might have signed it with a little bit of a meh, or they sign everything that causes trouble for the current leadership. So this is, compared to the conversations that we've had in the last week, this is quite dry territory. And I'm not going to lie to you, I'm glad. I think there is only so much chronicling of the decline of Western civilization that you can do as a human being. There are days when you don't look away, you certainly don't close your eyes, you don't start ignoring what is going on, but you remember that even as America falls, the rest of the world continues to turn, and the United Kingdom remains, for now at least, relatively insulated from the forces of fascism that are on the march in Minneapolis and elsewhere. Better to lose Gorton than to lose the mayoralty, but as David has already suggested, better to lose the mayoralty than to lose number 10, and that's your third or fourth moving part. So, what do you think? I mean, are you in the mood for how much trouble is Keir Starmer in? Because I think the writing's on the wall now for him. I don't see how people can be expected to march into battle behind him anytime soon in a general election. I could be wrong, but I just find myself, quite sadly, to be honest with you, because, as I say about beige food and dullness, the very easily and quickly forgotten madness of the last 14 years should be set in relief but the problem was you wanted calm competence, didn't you? And you don't feel that you're getting it. You might be getting calmness, but you don't feel that you're getting competence. So has Keir Starmer done the least bad thing in the circumstances? This was the phone-in that we were going to have at 12 o'clock yesterday until someone moved from the right to the far right. I forget their name. More on that later in the programme. And that is the conversation that I want to have with you, because I don't know. I don't know how you see this. I know how I see it, and I genuinely see it as he's probably done the right thing, but it's still awful. And those are the moments where you feel support for any politician or even any football manager seeping away. You recognise the difficulty of the situation that they find themselves in. You acknowledge that a lot of those difficulties are self-inflicted. An awful lot of the problems that the government currently faces are self-inflicted, most obviously in the context of policy reversals. 1 or 2 makes them look good and look like they're listening. 8 or 9 makes them look a little bit daft and increasingly ridiculous. The reason why he can't be a mayor and an MP, as Boris Johnson was for a while, is because he's also the PCC. The Mayor of London is currently not the Police and Crime Commissioner, but the Mayor of Manchester is, so he can't hold both jobs. Do you know, I asked Jim Waterson that yesterday from London Centric when he was in to talk to us about that amazing story involving TikTok, because I knew he'd know. He's that kind of character. I didn't know, but now you do. And it means that the notion of there being a good option was removed. There is no win here. Every single thing that Starmer could do from the moment that Andy Burnham announced that he wanted to run for Parliament again, every single thing that he could do was a bad option. Is there a word for that? Is it Hobson's choice? There are 3 or 4 paths he can go down, and every single one of them takes him to a place that is worse than the place he started out from. He looks frightened by not letting Burnham stand, but he keeps a Labour mayor in power in Manchester by not letting Burnham stand. He looks vulnerable if he lets Burnham stand, but he runs the risk of Burnham not winning the by-election, which is the worst of all possible worlds. This is the one line of defence I'd offer up for him, although I am, as you can probably tell, edging ever, ever closer to deciding that it's time for Starmer to be replaced. The one thing I would say is a fairly big obstacle to going for him on this occasion is that he's probably done the thing that a utilitarian would advise. Do I need to explain what utilitarianism is? To myself, not to you. I know you know. Just remind myself what utilitarianism is. It's almost as if you turn everything into a calculation and you leave emotion at the door. And what you do is essentially, it's where that phrase "for the greater good" comes from. Most 19th century philosophy was dedicated, or at least continental philosophy, was dedicated to trying to replace religion, to find a moral code that could replace a kind of slavish devotion to ancient texts and religion. So, you've got Kant's golden rule, which kind of boils down to do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. But utilitarianism, as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill finessed, was the idea that you just calculate, you almost have units called utiles, and you add up how many pluses would be created by doing something and how many negatives, and then you remove the negatives from the pluses, and what you're left with, however negative, is the best available option. And that's why I think that blocking Andy Burnham for a utilitarian was the right thing to do. But of course, that's only one school of philosophy. It might be for the greater good, but A, you might not see it that way or feel it that way, and B, that might be true today. Will it be true by the end of February when they've lost a by-election in traditional Labour heartlands? So there it is, 0345 6060973. Keir Starmer has blocked Andy Burnham. I don't want to have a phone in about whether Andy Burnham would be a better leader than Keir Starmer. We may have to have that phone in at some point, but it's off the table now, which is another moving part. That particular threat to his leadership has been removed. Because if you want threats to his leadership, you're not going to see that as a positive, which is where the problems with utilitarianism come in. But if you're Keir Starmer, calculating Keir Starmer's utility, then this was probably the right thing to do. Until you drive a coach and horses through my carefully constructed and surprisingly philosophical analysis. That's what I meant by being a little bit relieved that we're not talking about nurses being murdered on the streets of our cities by law enforcement officers in cold blood. Sometimes you've got to remember how lucky you are. 0345 6060973 is the number you need to talk to me about British politics and whether or not Keir Starmer has done the right thing in blocking Andy Burnham and what the ripple effect or the ramifications of this decision will be in your view. Alan is in Wandsworth. No ordinary Alan, a former Labour campaigns director. What's going on here, and is it the right course, albeit no one's going to claim that it's a good course to be on?
Good morning, James. Yes, he took the right decision. It's the only decision he could have taken, and it was the correct one in the circumstances.
Why?
There's no guarantee that Andy Burnham would have won the by-election. That would have led to the mayoral election. There's no guarantee Labour would have won that election. But even more important than that is taking the voters for granted. These voters elected Andy Burnham for a term of office that runs out in 2028. It's also rumoured that were Andy to become the mayoral candidate and create a vacancy in Manchester, one of the MPs in the area would become the candidate in Manchester, thus creating another parliamentary by-election. And so it goes on. And these are politicians that are using voters as pawns. They're taking them for granted in their own personal
You're talking
ambitions.
about Andy Burnham now.
Well, yes, he hasn't thought this through properly. He's thinking about his own ambition. He's not thinking about the voters. And all too often, politicians do forget the voters when it comes to their own ambitions. I kind of get it, because it's a big old greasy pole, and they come into politics with an ambition and think they can do well, and they have egos, and I get it. But the bottom line is it's the voters who put them there. But the Tories did it time after time. With their leadership elections.
You've got a point. Do we know how deeply voters feel this? Because I do think the one bit missing from a lot of the Westminster-based analysis is the Mancunian voters being told, yeah, all right, you might have voted for him to be your mayor 2 years ago, but, little pat on the head. The grown-ups are in the room now, and we're changing that. And that's quite contemptuous.
Yes, I think it is. I think it's using them as pawns. It's forgetting the power of the voters, and the voters are clever things, you know. They're clever beings. Well, they will work it out, and they will decide what they want to do, and they will get their own back if they ever want to.
And then a quick word, if you would, on Alan, on the relatively wet ammunition, and by that I just mean sort of damp ammunition given to the right wing media, most of whom have moved on from this story, but the Daily Mail's front page. Burnham rebellion growing. That is something that Starmer and his team factor in as an affordable cost.
Yes, they have to. I wish that those that in the Labour Party who want to get rid of Starmer listen to your introduction today and take the utilitarian approach to it, because now isn't the time to get rid of Starmer. If they do want to do it, if they're going to be clever, they'd do it 6, 8, 10, 12 months ahead of a general election, because that will give Labour the best chance of then going to the people and asking the people to endorse what the politicians have done behind the scenes.
A fresh offer. Thank you for that, Alan. It is 10:31. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I don't know. I'm getting a problem of observing these things partly through the lens of lobby correspondents who mostly work for newspapers and that are desperately and eternally dedicated to opposing anything that's not Tory or even further right than Tory. You kind of don't know about the scale of the problem. But 50 people signing a letter complaining about it is 50 people signing a letter complaining about it. It's not like 1922 committee letters of dissatisfaction. It's not up there with a sort of constant aura of threat that hung around Boris Johnson's final months or Liz Truss's entire premiership. So it's my job, isn't it, to cut through that and try and provide you with clearer analysis. But I can't. I can't without you. All I can tell you is that they seem quite desperate to get rid of Starmer. And if you think back to his predecessor, I never met a Tory. I never met a Tory who wanted Jeremy Corbyn to be replaced as leader of the Labour Party, even after he did much better than was expected in that election called by Theresa May, because Labour somehow, despite being led by a Leaver, became the last repository for hopes that Brexit might be reversed. I never met a Tory that wanted Jeremy Corbyn to be replaced. So the fact that the Tories really want Starmer to be replaced, the Tory press really want him to be replaced, might be significant, it might not, because whoever replaces him, they'll probably move on to character assassination of them as well. Corbyn's something of an exception in that rule. 10:32 is the time. Dominic Ellis has your headlines.